Hello to all scholars of conceptions of world politics. My name is Emma Hutchison, and today I'm stepping in to give somewhat of a guest session or guest lecture, especially now since you're nearing the kind of end of the course. Professor Bleicher has asked me in particular to come in and talk to you about some kind of new directions, or I think what is in the ECP is cutting edge theories of international relations, looking at kind of emerging ways that IR theory is going. I think since you've surveyed the kind of foundations or the underpinnings of IR theory and looked at a very broad sweep, now is a particularly appropriate time to be sort of actually looking at sort of the key trends in IR theory, and that's sort of what I'm going to do in today's talk. I have put together a plan for the session, and I'll pretty much get straight into it. But to begin with, as most of you probably would not know me, I thought I'd give you a little bit of information about myself, and with that also some words and thoughts on why exactly I love theory. And I'm going to interweave this with also some reflections actually on the importance or significance of international theory and the nature of theory in both conceptualising and practicing world politics. Having done this, I'll then begin to talk, or I'll talk about what I think are three new emerging directions in IR theory. At the outset, I'll stress these are not the only ways or kind of the only kind of cutting edge directions in theorising the international. There are certainly others, but these are the three that I would like to focus on. I've put them here at the outset so you can see, and the first one is what I've kind of characterised as a trend towards rethinking political agency. You may all have read about a lot of the turns, or you've seen some work across a lot of the turns you might have read throughout the semester on these, but certainly IR scholarship, and indeed lots of humanities and social science more generally, are very apt to point out to new ways of thinking and to characterise them as a turn as such. So you may already have read or seen about the aesthetic turn, perhaps the turn to emotions. So these are the sorts of things I'm thinking about, and I'd like to discuss them, I think, as what I think is a trend to rethink political agency. And I, of course, will come to define how we can conceptualise agency when there. The second, and I think a very important and significant trend that is permeating very broadly across all scholarly disciplines, not just social science and humanities, but indeed the more practical sciences as well, and also things such as legal studies and so on, is the shift towards decolonial theory and what is seen as the imperative and need to decolonise political knowledge and practices. So I'll leave it there because I'm going to, of course, turn to it and we'll discuss it. But this I see as a particularly imperative trend. The third is what I also call or think about as the increasing interweaving of theory and everyday political practices, and then in turn how theory can help us to understand policy. Again, I'll talk in more depth about this, but there has been in recent years in international relations, there's been a lot of talk about the potentials, or that theory is dead, that there's the death of theory, that, you know, you've all surveyed a lot of these key theories, realism, liberalism, you've gone through the great debates and so on, the shift towards behaviouralism, and then the critiques coming from feminism, post-structuralism, postmodernism, and post-colonial thought. And there's sort of been a trend or a sort of thought that perhaps even we have all these theories, but I think there's even one article saying we have all these theories, but the bodies keep lining up. So it's sort of been, scholars have suggested that theory, in fact, has not, there's the death of theory, and we have all these theories, but they've not really done much. Whereas I actually would suggest the opposite, And I feel there is a trend of increasingly interweaving theory and practice, and I'll talk in more depth about that. I should say also, I think that's a particularly important trend for you all, not just in understanding scholarship and how it interweaves with practice and policy, but, you know, when you move out into the world beyond your studies, I believe this is something that will help you to understand how theory shapes the very practices and policies that we are creating in the political world, and indeed also in turn reflecting on the policies through different theoretical lenses. But as I said, I'll get to that. In sum, then to move on, I thought I'd give a sort of summary of what we've gone through, and also look forward to the future of theory, increasing again interwoven nature of theory and practice and how it's manifesting in particular types of social and political movements across the world. So that's the plan, and with that I think I'll move on. The only other thing I guess I'd like to stress is that, and I'm sure Professor Bleicher has said, this is sort of somewhat of a summary, or like where are we at now in IR theory type of session. I understand you've got essays due in the next 10 to 14 days, so I'd like to make this as easygoing and conversational as I can, and it's really just something for you all to have some kind of like sort of a new food for thought about theory, to reflect more broadly on the types of theories and the full scope of theories that you've gone through the course, and perhaps how they matter more broadly, and also more practically. So with that, I will move on. So, excuse me, as I said, I understand that lots of you probably don't know me, so a little bit of background about myself. I'm a research fellow, an Australian Research Council DECRA fellow in the school here at UQ. My background lies in politics and international relations, and my work, I think, could probably be said to exist at the kind of nexus between international relations, peace and conflict studies, and political theory. But with this, my work is very interdisciplinary, and I'm a strong advocate for highly interdisciplinary work. I think a lot of the new ideas we've come to in international relations, the new, I think, and really important ideas, in fact, come from a range of other disciplines that have that have advanced before us. So I always stress a need for creativity and to looking far beyond the field of international relations for new ideas, and the need to bring those new ideas together in order to conceptualise the world and world politics more fully. So my work, more specifically, focuses on emotions and trauma in world politics, and I've particularly looked at this in the context of understanding, or more fully understanding, discourses of security, humanitarianism, and international aid. My first book was published a couple of years ago, and I have an image here on the right. It's called Affective Communities in World Politics. And this book essentially seeks to theorise the roles of emotions in world politics. It does that, or I've done that, by first of all suggesting that we need to take emotions and the roles of emotions in everyday life more seriously and not dismiss them as typical Western rational models do. And the book more specifically, or in particular, it looks at how the emotional dimensions of representing trauma kind of create forms of meaning that prompt collective notions of identity and community. So key here really is, in my work or in this book, how emotions associated with trauma can either reinstate existing forms of identity and community, such as the case usually, say for instance, after terrorism in a national context, or in fact the emotions associated with witnessing traumatic events, typically through the media, can in fact transform forms of identity and community. So emotions in this sense can be actually transgressive forces that pull people together and change prevailing constellations of community and responsibility. And my work has particularly looked at the politics and ethics at stake. My new work emerges from this book, or my previous work, and focuses more particularly on the role of emotions in humanitarian discourses through history, and in turn how that helps us to think about humanitarianism in the future. But I guess one thing for you all that I think is most relevant, aside, or not really essentially looking at my work, is actually, so my work is highly conceptual, and I also guess wanted to stress that theory has always fascinated me. While I do not think that you can divorce theory from the practical realities in which we are situated and operate, and create policies to represent and so on, I think that, and as I'll get to in the next slide, I think theory has been one of the mainstays of my work, and I guess it has always fascinated me because the types of theories as well you've gone through, as you can probably see having surveyed so many, they each provide a very different lens to understanding the same realities we exist in. They provide different perspectives and purviews. They help to explain different ways of thinking politically, and they also are prescriptive. So particularly, as you'll know, in theories such as realism and liberalism have been very prescriptive in this sense and have in fact dominated much of the history in practical everyday world politics. So, I know this is a video, but if I was talking to you, I would certainly love to get your thoughts on what you think is the importance or significance of theory in international relations, or if indeed you do think it's important. If I could talk to you now, I would certainly ask you before I present any ideas here. And I hope, I guess, through the course you've gained some takeaway about the significance of the different conceptual lenses through which we can appreciate world politics. So I guess to begin, as I've just said, so to reiterate, I think theory is really important, and the types of conceptions we hold about world politics and the different lenses through which we can think about world politics are invaluable because they provide us different ways to understand the practice of international relations. They're certainly each very distinct in their focus, and they're also based on various different assumptions about the world and about individuals and about political action. And I think having a holistic understanding of those different theories can only enhance each of our reflections on the nature of international relations itself and the nature of particular actions, whether you're interested in understanding the climate crisis, whether you're interested in understanding the treatment of asylum seekers and refugees, whether you want to understand reactions to terrorism or how we should respond to internal civil conflicts. So I think theories help us in a very totalistic type of way, the different theories we have, to understand these very practical dilemmas we face every day and policymakers and analysts face every day. But with this, to move on to, I guess, to the nature of theory, And as certainly you will have seen through going through the sort of sweep of theory or of international political theory over time, theories are constantly changing. They're evolving. And they're evolving with the different ways we've sort of, I guess, the different developments in our thinking and perceiving of political action itself. I'm not quite sure how the different theories have been pitched to you, but as you've probably, or as you would have read at least through some of your other courses, there's been some key debates, or what they call the great debates in IR theory, which first started with the emergence of realism in the early 20th century, and then moving on to sort of the question of liberalism, and whether liberalism can, in fact, whether the push for cooperation and interdependence and the institutionalization of collective regimes, can they in fact counter the type of anarchical worldview of realism? From here, they moved on to debates of behaviouralism and the push towards empiricism, I guess, in the 60s. And then slowly there was also the emergence of post-structuralism and the push, and also critical theories, and the push to deconstruct and actually really critically reflect upon some of the very singular assumptions in theories such as realism, neorealism, liberalism, and so on. So again, I guess I don't want to belabor the point, but to come back on why I love theory, I guess having an understanding of all of these different theories, as you all would now, they provide a different prism, I think, to essentially understand, as I've said, everyday actions and reactions in world politics. They provide, as such, I think, tools, for us to critically reflect and engage, and also to think, so not only for ourselves, but also to think about how others are engaging with the world, how others may be responding, the things they may be thinking or fearing, the types of attitudes and understandings and worldviews that may in fact be driving their policies. So with this, as I've said, and with the idea that theories are constantly evolving and changing, I'd like to now move on to what I think are three new and emerging directions. Perhaps you could call these cutting edge types of trends in IR theory. As I said, they're by no means the only trends. Perhaps for some they may even be disputed, but I would suggest these are kind of three key trends, and they're also trends which I thought that you all may be particularly interested in as young people and as the new generation of IR theorists and IR practitioners. So I'll move on from there. Excuse me. So the first trend, or the first kind of new direction. Now I've labelled this what I call, or what I think it about more generally as perhaps a push to rethink agency in world politics. I should stress that what I'm about to say has not essentially, I don't think it's really been presented in even academic journals as such, but it's something that I've been thinking about for some time, reading across IR theory for my own work. So, but I do think that, and as I'll detail soon, I think that a lot of these new theories can perhaps be summarised or perhaps thought of in this way. So to begin with, and I've asked Professor Blacker how much you know about agency, the concept of political agency. I'm not sure if you remember it from debates on structure versus agency that are inherent in, or that came to be in kind of constructivist literature. But I guess to reiterate for you now, agency is essentially, I guess I'd think about it as the capacity of individuals to act independently and make their own choices. So that's what I would think of as agency, individual and collective agency as such. So that means how can, what type of capacities or capabilities do we have to be free, to make our own choices and decisions? You may in turn remember that there is the key idea of structure, so this structure agency debate, which has really raged through history and through political thought. And structure can in turn, or vice versa, be thought of as the kind of factors such as social class, gender, ethnicity, particular forms of social regulation that in fact determine or limit our capacity to make decisions and choices. So there is this ongoing kind of debate and dichotomy. To what extent are we free? To what extent are we bound by the conditions of social structures? So I want to focus specifically on agency, and that's our capacity to be free to make choices. And I suggest this is where a lot of literature is seeking to re-theorise from different angles. And I've got here, so they're forwarding what I think a lot of new ideas about political agency. New ideas to help us better understand the capacity of individuals and collectives to shape their own fates. And these new ideas essentially emerge, I think, or they're seeking to theorise agency more from the ground up. So from the level of everyday actions, rather than, as you've seen in most theories in IR, rather than from top down. So a lot of theories, as you've seen, again, sorry to keep saying that, a lot of theories really provide a picture of world politics and international relations as being driven by, again, what I've got here is top down. So that's sort of like the macro processes, the institutions, the focuses of governance through which IR takes place on an everyday level. This is, say, take for instance, realism and liberalism. In these theories, states are the key actors, not individuals. They're states. States, and in liberalism, you probably then again emphasize things such as institutions. Institutions that help to bind forms of cooperation that counter the type of atomistic actions that may pervade or are perceived to pervade in a realist worldview. Moving on, I guess, if you wanted to move on to some forms of constructivism, perhaps norms may indeed be a key focus. And again, a norm, while norms are in fact shaped and they emerge from social contexts, from everyday lived realities, rather than focusing on those, traditional forms of constructivism, again, look top down. They look to see how states and other forms of international actors are in fact subject to, or perhaps entrepreneurs of, which is a very popular term these days, of such norms. So against these types of ideas, and probably in the wake of theories such as feminism, post-structuralism, postmodernism, and post-colonialism, a lot of scholars now are turning, excuse the pun, they're turning to different forms of political agency. They're seeking to theorise these big macro structures, states, institutions, norms, and so on, through the everyday actors that are both affected by such structures and institutions, and who in fact can in fact, through the push of social movements, can in fact direct, motivate, change such things. So to move on to actually articulate how this sort of rethinking of agency takes place, I suggest it's through different turns. Now, as I said, you might already have read in your own reading for different courses or through this course, you might have read about some of these turns. But there are an immense number of them. As I've said here, IR theorists and scholars seem to not be able to stop turning at the moment. There's a lot of critique about that, but we don't need to go into that here. But I think the most prominent ones at the moment is, for instance, the local turn. So this is a turn away, again, away from looking at states and large actors and so on, and away from the global to in fact look at the local contexts, kind of the cultural environments and situations in which world politics takes place at an everyday level. Somewhat associated with this is again the turn to the everyday. What is the everyday? So the everyday would essentially be thought of, or you could think of it as the very ways in which higher up forms of politics and policy affect us, affect our daily actions. So this is a turn to kind of the everyday constellations of power, again, political action and agency, and looking at how they manifest for everyday lives, kind of like on the ground, so to speak. This is also manifest, so this sort of local cultural turn, combined with the shift towards the everyday, is also looking in turn at what's called the micro-macro debate. So you could think of the macro, and we don't need to talk too much about this. We could think of the macro, again, as the top-down types of broader institutions, states, norms, and so on. And the micro. The micro is about understanding the processes, the everyday ways that these types of political actors and so on are constituted and transgressed on the ground. Then there's the turn to other forms of knowledge as well. Not unassociated with seeking to understand the local and the cultural, but somewhat distinct, and that these other forms turn to, these other turns essentially shift towards understanding, I think, politics on an even more micro level. They're looking towards the emotions we feel. My work has been situated in this field of what's called the emotional or the affective turn. I also should stress this, the emotional turn, the turn to the body, the aesthetic turn and the visual turn. All of these turns are in fact occurring quite consistently across the broader social sciences and the humanities. But in these, or what is key, is essentially looking to how, what can emotions, what can bodily forms of experience, what can the everyday things we do, from brushing our teeth to how we, to how we, what sort of water we drink, how we get to work, what transport and so on. What do these things actually tell us about the lived realities, the social and political realities we operate in? And finally, to talk a little bit there about the aesthetic and visual turns, your course convener, Professor Bleicher, has been key in this regard. And the aesthetic turn was something he coined along with some others in around 2000. And this turn was essentially kind of to try and look at what can we gain from aesthetic, from artistic, from other forms of knowledge and knowledge production, for instance, art, literature, poetry, and so on. What can we gain by looking at these sources of these sources? What sort of insights can we gain that we cannot by looking through conventional forms of political knowledge? So that's the first kind of key trend. I hope that made somewhat sense, but essentially I think if I had to summarize for you in one sentence, it would probably be that there's a shift towards understanding agency from a more basic, everyday lived reality type of level. There's an imperative sort of to actually bring ourselves, to bring individuals back into the equation, probably after the plethora of so much focus on institutions and states. There's a shift towards trying to incorporate and take seriously what individuals and their local communities think, feel, how they do things, and what do macro types of theories neglect. Okay, now the second key trend or new direction, and this is one that I have been fascinated in and have been trying to read about a lot and try to figure out how to take into account in many different aspects of my academic career and work, not just scholarship, but also practices of teaching, and the various sites of knowledge production which we each engage. So this is decolonial theory, also called decoloniality, decolonialism. At the outset, I should probably stress that this is not decolonisation. Okay, you would have read, you would have heard about in your other courses about decolonisation as a period, and that is probably what is the best way to think about decolonisation vis-a-vis decolonial theory. So decolonisation is, is the kind of historical period through which, or the historical period when formal, the formal period of colonisation of colonial powers taking over lands that were not theirs, when that ended. So decolonial theory is quite distinct from that historical era. Okay, so what is decolonial theory? Decolonial theory, also I should say decolonial theory is very different to post-colonial theory, or is distinct from. And this is in two ways. First of all, in terms of when it was, or how, or when, where it was produced. So post-colonial theory is typically seen to have emerged from subaltern forms of knowledge, particularly Indian political theory, whereas decolonial theory has emerged somewhat from Latin America political theorists and scholars. But I think the key difference, the most notable difference, is not so much about where they emerged from, but instead it's about decolonial theory takes perhaps a more profound view of colonialism than post-colonial theory. And in fact, while post-colonial theory is somewhat seen as an extension of the kind of political theory project, or it can be subsumed into the political theory project of the West, decolonial theory in fact proposes that what is called a kind of coloniality of power did not end with colonialism. So this is to say that the very modes of thought and knowledge production that still abound today, decolonial theory suggests that these are still bound by Western forms of power, and that Western colonial power has in fact not ended, and it stresses the need to recognise this and problematise Eurocentric colonial ways of doing and thinking. So there are a few key points here that I hope to render intelligible. But the first one would probably be that decolonial theory sees the project of Western modernity and the rationality through which political thinking has been bound is distinctly Eurocentric and colonial. And they see this as problematic. They see it, in fact, as silencing non-Western, non-Eurocentric ways of thinking and doing. I think this is very important, in fact, as emerging range of articles have actually shown, because they think, or they suggest that, and I'm quoting one article here by Zeynep Kapan, who's a Turkish scholar, and they suggest that international relations as a discipline has come to define political time and space through what are Western conceptions of modernity. Okay, so this means that how we think of, conceive and practice international relations is based on Eurocentric worldviews, Eurocentric forms of rationality, Western forms of rationality, and that this in turn silences the colonial past of world politics and the constitutive role colonialism plays in the world today. And they see this as inherently problematic. And as such, decolonial theory, I've put some quotes here by one of a prominent theorist, Walter Mignolo. He says decolonial theory is such a form of epistemic disobedience. So in essence here, it's seeking to in fact counter the forms of Western rationality and modernity that have proliferated and continue to proliferate in the world today. Another very famous Latin American sociologist, Anibal Quijano, some of you would be much more worse in Spanish than me, she calls decolonial theory in turn, following Mignolo, a form of epistemic reconstruction. So what's important here is that it doesn't just stop at critique. Some critique of, say, postmodernism or post-colonial theory is that it's very much critiquing and seeking to deconstruct the forms of knowledge that abound and proliferate and dictate the ways of thinking and theorizing in international relations as beyond. But it can also help to inform ways of reconstructing or thinking differently about forms of knowledge. And to do this, they stress the importance of subaltern, non-Western, and indigenous knowledges. So they seek to try and bring these to the fore, and in fact, come to ways of thinking and knowledge production that liberate us of Western forms of rationality and modernity. So that's probably the first key point. The second, that they suggest in reconstructing or kind of trying to think differently outside of Western forms of rationality, decolonial theorists seek in turn to deconstruct what's called the coloniality of world power. They seek to make way for new forms of knowledge, new forms of communication. They seek to value different forms of experiences and meanings and come to different understandings of what has come to be thought of as rational. They also would not suggest that any of these forms of knowledge, these indigenous, non-Western forms of knowledge, the decolonial knowledges, they would not suggest they're universals, as Western modernity has arguably done. But they seek to bring to the fore particularistic decolonial ways of thinking. And I think a lot of this has been driven, as the final point here, is a concern for the power dynamics at stake in the world today and in international relations. They seek to understand how the types of power that governs the very acquisition of knowledge through which different theoretical perspectives and in turn policies and practices are constituted. And one key trend, I guess, as well, is that this questions out the very modes through which we teach in universities. I think, as you've all seen, a lot of the theories through which international relations has emerged are uniquely, or not, I shouldn't say uniquely, but they're Western, they're Eurocentric, they're based on Eurocentric worldviews. So decolonial theory questions the preference of those theories and, in fact, how we teach them. I know in this course, I think that the order has been flipped, and I'm sure, and I know Professor Black has done that intentionally to introduce you to forms of deconstruction before, in fact, you gain before you go through some of the more totalizing, more universalistic theories that international relations has been premised on. And I think, while I think you may have started with feminism, this is something like a key trend that decolonial theory would stress. although, or albeit not necessarily with feminism, but they do. What key here is that they're questioning how, in fact, we acquire knowledge and the preferences that are implicit in the acquisition of knowledge. So that's just a very short snippet, a broad overview, I think, against a very complex, very important and very timely field. And I'm sure some of you would probably be very interested in pursuing that in the future. So the third trend, and somewhat cumulatively, I think, which I'll talk about, is I think the implicit, or it's sort of implicit at the moment, but an imperative to actually combine theory with practice, to understand how theories are working in action, in policies, in political practices, perhaps not policies, but in behaviours and so on. And as I said, there have been some scholars suggesting that theory is in fact dead, that we've gone through a long line of theory without much change, and that theorising has had its day. But given as well the types of innovations I've just been speaking about, on one hand, I think that's incorrect or a misnomer, but you can also see more tangibly in lots of the IR scholarship the importance of theory playing out in practice. There is, I've got here, an increasing application of a complexity of theoretical frames to understand what is also the seemingly increasing complexity of political practices and policies. You could take, for instance, the climate crisis here. You can analyse the climate crisis through many different lenses, and there are many different purviews and prerogatives taking shape. There's, I guess most prominently, there's sort of the old ways of thinking versus new forms of agency, as I've just spoken about, new forms of preferencing individual lives and environments in which we each experience and live out our lives, which in turn, I think with the climate crisis has in fact pushed individuals, and particularly the younger generation, you all watching this video, to actually engage in everyday forms of resistance, to transgress the very old established forms of power, macro power that have been operating. And there's been a lot of work across this area, and it's only growing and growing. Another example, and I have a photo here of Kim Jong-un and Donald Trump meeting at the border at the DMZ, but there's also, say, for instance, an increasing re-theorisation of practices of diplomacy, of practices of political leadership and signalling from states, also understanding, I guess, how emerging technologies are helping to both mobilise social movements, social movements at the local level, and also helping to or contributing to different modes of state behaviour. And I think this is a space that is increasingly growing. Scholars are seeking more and more to integrate multiple different theoretical and conceptual frames into understanding these dynamics more fully, more holistically. And this can only be a good thing, I would suggest, as it means that we are starting to understand the complexities. We're starting to really take them into consideration more, and rather than seek towards some kind of knowledge or some kind of certainty, we are instead understanding that there is an ambiguity of perspectives and that we need to understand more and more of them to have a more complete political picture. And I guess to pause, that's probably, I might have it on the final slide as well. I think that's why it's so important that you all learn about different conceptual frames. I've got here that theory is key to understanding world politics more fully. I was going to tell you at the start of this lecture, and I forgot, my apologies, but actually the way I discovered theory was through the very course you're taking now, when I was an undergraduate. And prior to that, I mean, both world politics and international theory was a very different place 20 years ago. But learning about the different ways we conceptualize, critique, reflect, deconstruct political realities really opened my mind and my world to understanding world politics differently. Back then, this was a time of realism and liberalism prevailing quite quite universally. Perhaps there was a bit of constructivism thrown in there in an attempt to understand the social constitution of particular realities. But understanding about the power of deconstruction and critique and reflection, and the fact that we can, I guess, drill down deeper into how particular political behaviours take shape and the ideas that have constituted them. I think it's something, it really opened up my mind and my eyes to conceptualising different forms of international action differently. And this is why I think probably the key reason I think theory is critical. Personally, I find looking at different international behaviours and policies and so on from different theoretical purviews actually quite fun. As I've got here, I really believe it cultivates a form of intellectual empathy. It may not necessarily always be an enjoyable form of empathy, but you can come to see different, very real, everyday actions and the types of worldviews, whether it's the worldviews of a realist or a liberalist, probably less frequently in policy, the worldviews of a post-structuralist. Perhaps post-colonialism is coming in more, and I do hope the decolonial turn will proliferate more fully. But I think having an understanding and being able to hold these different worldviews in your mind when analysing different events really cultivates a form of empathy that can only help to understand why things are the way they are. They can help to puzzle through the makeup of different social and political realities, questioning why society and politics is as it is, and how can that questioning in turn transform? How can we use it as to have transformative power and open up worlds? So that's kind of in sum. As I said, I surveyed these 3 new directions. There's many more out there. And that is our job now as international relations scholars, both you all and us alike, is to, I think, continue to look at what the different theoretical lenses we have, what they highlight, what they silence and marginalise and forget, and to try and look more and more at what silences are out there and how can we hold different worldviews in our heads at once and come to a more complete, hopefully more just and reflexive understanding of international relations. So I really can't wait to see what's next in the world of IR theory. It's a field I'm continually reading across. I think my generation of scholars is making huge leaps and bounds forward, but I'm very excited to see what your generation is going to do, as I think you're a really transformative generation that is much more, in my sense, is much more much more keen to embrace the powers of resistance and transgression than any generation I have seen. So I'm really looking forward to seeing what's next. I hope some of you will be a part of that, whether in academia or indeed in the very policies that make the changes, they create change for all of us. So I also hope my generation and those above me, we do a good job in equipping you with the particular skills you need. My door is always open if anyone would like to come and talk to me about anything that I've spoken about, or just theory or their work or their essays more generally. Please do feel free to send me an email and drop by. I wish you all very best and good luck for the course. I hope you've enjoyed this short lecture to accompany. I think you have others for this week. And so good luck, and thank you very much all for listening. Okay, bye.